Hi all. For today's notable game, I thought we could complete the jigsaw for the 1985 Karpov against Kasparov match for looking at all the decisive games. The decisive game we haven't looked at yet is game 22. So Anatoly Karpov playing white against Kasparov kicked off with d4. So this is 5th of November 1985, played in Moscow. We see d5, c4, e6, classic. Queen's Gambit declined, and Kasparov doesn't play knight f6, but rather bishop e7, discouraging obviously an early bishop g5 here, and prompting white usually to play knight f3. But another popular move is c takes d5, so Karpov fixes the center. E takes d5, bishop f4. Bishop deployed on f4 is very interesting. Knight f6, e3. Castles, we see knight f3, and now black plays bishop f5. In this position you might think there's a neglect of b7, but say queen b3, knight c6 is good here, and if takes then knight b4, and black has big threats. So instead of queen b3 we see h3, which has got some venom behind it. As we'll see, after c6 we see a very aggressive move by Karpov, who's trailing in the match. He really needs to win this game. He plays g4, very aggressive expansion on the king side. Is he creating weaknesses here? We see bishop g6, knight e5, and white potentially is going to play h4. This knight on e5 is challenged with knight fd7. So this knight hasn't moved yet. It really wants to move and take part in this, challenging the advanced knight on e5. That takes off the bishop, and a very interesting decision. You might think an ugly decision by Kasparov structurally is played here. He plays f takes g6, and it does obviously offer some dynamic piece play, and there might be ideas like bishop h4, maybe even g5, but let's have a look. Why wasn't h takes g entertained? Possibly white is getting a good game here, like this kind of thing. This is an example continuation where white could play h4 potentially. It's a dangerous h file. It'd be dangerous for black to take that pawn. There's some strong kingside pressure being exerted in this particular position. If h5 is coming, it starts to look dangerous. Just to check this out a little bit, because this is a strange structural decision. Here, bishop takes c7, and that's a loose piece then. And you might think, hold on, is this really good, this h4? Let's follow it through. Knight e6, h5, or bishop g3. Sorry, pardon me, bishop g3. And then here with h5 to follow, this is given by engines as slightly better for white actually. You know, maybe this is possibly the decision. It seems to be a close call between them anyway, technically, from an engine perspective. But f takes g, you know, to the human eye might look a little bit strange. We see bishop g2 putting pressure on d5, knight b6. And with this, black is preparing to just swap off, you know, the bishop here with bishop d6. He's made way for bishop d6. White castles. We see king h8, getting out of potential dangers on this diagonal. Now knight e2, g5, bishop g3, bishop d6, challenging this bishop on g3. The queen goes to d3. It seems a nice square for the queen in this particular position. Knight a6, as though knight b4 might be on the cards, but actually the main concern for Anatoly Karpov seems to be this other knight. He plays actually b3, restricting this other knight. Now you might think knight b4, I think the queen could just go back basically to d2 and it wouldn't be a problem. That's not tested here, just queen e7. Karpov now takes on d6, and the idea is revealed here. He's changing the structure radically with further kingside expansion. With the two knights over here, it's interesting, this expansion on the kingside now. f4 is played, challenging this pawn on g5. This is taken. Now e takes f4. Now white hasn't got the dark square bishop, and it seems as though e3 is a vulnerability. In general, the e file looks slightly fragile for white. Kasparov plays rook a e8, but now we see after f5 some of the ideas behind this whole thing is starting to unravel. There might be knight f4 to e6, for example. We see knight c7 securing e6 in advance. Rook f2. We see knight d7. Now the knights are getting closer to the center, but now g5 stretching out further on the king side. Queen e7, and there's an entry point here, e3. After h4, well, is also attacking g5, so white plays h4, protecting g5, and we see this invasion point being used. Karpov calmly protects his queen. What he seems to be evolving from the opening is a space advantage on the king side, but is it a source of vulnerability? We see knight b5. Is this d pawn weak? Is the e square weak? Is the knight going to reroute? Karpov takes on e3, and now actually plays king h2. We see knight b6 in this position. Knight g3, and the point of knight b6 is revealed. This is a rerouting maneuver to e4 and hit f5. Knight f1, kicking the rook. Rook d3. The knight comes back, so it looks to be centralizing quite well. Knight g3 protecting f5. That's been hit twice. But now here we see knight e4. This might be a little bit not very cautious. The engine suggests here, instead of knight e4, rook e1. And this is annoying. It's an infiltration which is slightly annoying, and it should be about equal. This continuation here, for example, would seem to be tenable for black if black can set up basically a blockade against the pawn majority here, the 3-2, and black has this rook here. It seems as though black shouldn't be able to lose this that easily. But we see something very interesting in the game actually. With knight e4, black potentially, Kasparov is potentially creating now a weak pawn. And he may have thought that the weak pawn's no problem because white's got a weak pawn. You know, if white ever takes like this, surely white's d pawn is weak. And this is fascinating philosophically actually, because then we get into an area called, well, Nimzovich called it the exchange of prisoners, where you exchange one weakness for another. Now just imagine this all happens and somehow we could take this and exchange d4 for e4. What we'd be left with is essentially a transition into a position where the space advantage might be nice. The 3-2 might be nice here if these two pawns were removed from the board and the minor pieces went. Now to achieve this though, the exchange of prisoners by Karpov here is very interesting. He does weaken this pawn, and he does offer now his d pawn. But the interesting thing here after knight takes d4 is that white is actually not in a position to immediately take that, to get this transition mentioned where white might have a nice advantage. He can't actually take on e4. This is actually what you must consider a delayed exchange of prisoners, but the outcome is the same. When the smoke clears here, white might be left with a small space advantage heading for the endgame, and white plays a classy move. So looking at this in advance, so if f5 is secure at the moment against the knight and the rook, a classy move now which adds weight to this concept, this delayed exchange of prisoners or exchange of weaknesses, you might like to call it instead. What does white play in this position if I give you 5 seconds starting from now? It's a fantastically strong positional move. So he sacrificed the pawn here temporarily, and he can't get his pawn back immediately. He's dissolved, Karpov has dissolved his weak d pawn, of course. But what does he do here? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video starting from now. King h3. He brings the king up, not that, to support king g4, to support this pawn, and then gang up later on this. There's also rook f4 if needed. And we see this happening. If knight f3, of course, we can use the pin, by the way, as well. So black, seemingly, actually, with king g4 now, strengthening f5, black's e-pawn seems to be a goner, actually. The exchange of prisoners is going to happen whether Kasparov likes it or not in this position. Rook f4 is going to happen. If black tries to defend this, then rook f4, the pawn is dropping off for sure. This is 100% going to happen. And just if you're cynical about it, I'll check this position once more. In the game, the rather aggressive h5 was played. But let's just imagine in this position, h5 isn't played. Rook f4. Let's say knight f3. We can take on e4. And it's still a pleasant position for white. The transition has happened. We have a 3-2 pawn majority here. The king is more active than black's king. King f4 hugging the pieces, I sometimes call them. And this is fine. This is nice for white. So Kasparov lashes out here. He lashes out with this move h5 check, trying to distract things. But it still is leading to a similar advantageous situation for white. The king is going to be more aggressive than black's king. For the moment now, we've equalised it on pawns. Now black is again a pawn up. And we have simplification where it's equal on pawns. And white has transitioned into a very nice looking rook and pawn ending with the king exceptionally more aggressive than black's king. So the temporary pawn sacrifice has still yielded an endgame advantage here, a very concrete endgame advantage. In fact, king g6 is now threatened with horrible things like rook e8 mating the black king. So king h7 is played. After rook e7, stopping g6 and hitting these pawns, the rook on the 7th is very advantageous for white. Kasparov is pretty helpless here. He plays actually b5, giving up a7. Let's check this particular position if the white king is actually very decisive here. If rook b5, the problem is a4. Black can never take on b3 because then we have a mate, g6, and rook e8, checkmate. And if rook d5, keeping the pawn pinned, then we just take here anyway. White's got the advantage. So Kasparov actually just let his a7 pawn go, and it's still a horrible position. We see b4 being played, and now king g4. And at move 42 here, Kasparov resigned. He resigned this position. Let's take some examples. It clearly looks bad. Is it as bad as it looks? Say this, rook c7 or h5. These are strong moves. And h6 is now threatened. And if we throw some checks in, we can annoy with these checks, but they're going to run out. And say we reach this position, then h6, and then actually here, the king is closer to these guys. So this is hopeless for black. We could just get a winning king and pawn ending here. End of game. We're going to be winning these pawns. Winning this pawn. Yeah. It's the game Let's have a look to go to the final position. What did we just witness? Because it seems as though Kasparov wasn't given much counterplay in this game. What did we just witness? A transition into a winning rook and pawn ending of the king, very aggressive. It was actually equal on pawns, but qualitatively, White's pieces are actually winning here, it seems. Yeah. So what do we get from this game? It seems that Karpov played the opening in a very interesting manner, actually, fixing the centre early, this h3, gaining some space advantage on the king side later, and sorting out his own d4 weakness by arranging a kind of exchange of weaknesses scenario to transition basically into an advantageous endgame. So the beautiful idea of the delayed pawn sacrifice is at work here for this trade of weaknesses. And that left White still with his trump card, the endgame trump card, the aggressive king in the endgame, the aggressive rook. And even with a single rook at each, a decisive position for White is reached, a decisive advantage here. So remarkable, simple, logical play defeated Kasparov in this game. I hope you got something from it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.